Welcome to a very special co-production of Brain Navat and Microaggressions. I'm going to hand over to Spencer Case.
I'm here with Mark Oppenheimer and Jason Werbeloff, your hopefully familiar Brain in the Vat hosts, and we're doing an episode together. I planned to do a whole episode of going down through the top 10 best thought experiments of all time. I thought we'd come up with our list of thought experiments and then add up the points, see which one came out on top. But it turns out we all came up with completely different thought experiments. So that's not going to work. So what I've decided to do is say, okay, let's just have a hour long or so discussion of thought experiments and our favorite ones and just see where it takes us without any pressure for getting anywhere. Okay. So I just want to begin with this question. What is a thought experiment? Anyone have any ideas?
It's a really nice question. I think it's a what if. So it's a question, what if, with a particular goal in mind. So the goal is to talk about a situation which will provide either a counterexample to a principle or an affirmation of the principle. And the situation that you're what ifing needs to be sufficiently different from the everyday life situation where that principle is instantiated. So I think it's a method of abstracting out of our everyday lives in a way that's still concrete, because the what if will be a very specific scenario. And then at the same time, we're trying to draw a conclusion about a principle that we can apply in our everyday lives.
What's interesting is why we use thought experiments on Brain Navat to start our episodes is we think that it concretizes the mind. So you've got this narrative story, that there's a puzzle that you're trying to solve, that it should play with your intuitions, that you have a strong view on something. And often the experiment will push you to go, oh, that runs counter to my ordinary intuition. Let me think about, what the underlying principle is, and maybe that needs to be revised. Or maybe, this case can be distinguished from the other cases. But it's a wonderful way to start a conversation. What's interesting is when I've taught thought experiments at universities, there are kind of two categories of people broadly. There are those who get on board, love it, and there are those who object because they say that would never happen. And they can't do the imaginative exercise. So you tell them about the trolley problem and they just say, but I'm never going to be in a situation where I'm going to be driving a train. So what? And that kind of person probably just isn't suited to philosophy very well, and just struggles with thinking in an abstract way. But the others that can do that, really just have the most fun. And what's cool about thought experiments is that I think it's a good way to make philosophical progress. But also you can take them and do, other mind-bending things with them. If you think about, how much science fiction is indebted to thought experiments, Jason himself's a sci-fi writer and has taken wonderful thought experiments and stretched them out into these much bigger worlds.
So I want to propose a more expansive definition of thought experiments. I think maybe, Jason, what you said could be too narrow. Like it has this, it's a what if that has a particular purpose. And I agree that often they do in philosophy, but there are thought experiments that are just supposed to expand your imagination or try to help you think about something that aren't necessarily testing a principle. Einstein would wonder when he was a kid what it was like to ride on a beam of light. What would he would see if he was on a beam of light? And I think at the time he wasn't trying to test any principle. He was just letting his imagination go. It's a kind of a thought experiment. And another thing I'd say is sometimes what I tell my students is a thought experiment is a story that helps us clarify our thinking about things. And so that is a broader definition than some would give. And in other contexts, when I'm not first introducing it to undergrads, I might want to say something more restricted. So, for example, it seems to me that Plato's allegory of the cave, where people are in this cave and they're seeing shadows in the wall, and they think that that's reality, and they wander outside. And okay, so this story is meant to illustrate a set of doctrines, a set of ideas about education, but it's not like testing our intuitions about a theory or anything. You're not really supposed to imagine yourself. What would my intuition be about this circumstance or something like that? So depending on how we define a thought experiment, that might count or it might not.
That's really interesting. I listened to a great episode of Stuff to Blow Your Mind where they went through lots and lots of different thought experiments. And they were saying that certain thought experiments are not legitimate and others are legitimate. And I think we're going to have an argument about that at some point. But what was interesting was they mentioned Einstein's thought experiment and some other science-based thought experiments as typically great. In other words, like they're prototypically amazing thought experiments. And I thought, I wonder if they're thought experiments at all. So on your broader definition, they count, but on mine, they wouldn't. I mean, suppose I say, imagine dropping a bowling ball and a feather at the same time, but removing all the air in the room. Which one will hit the floor first? That's a sort of well-known science thought experiment. But is it a thought experiment at all? It seems like you're not imagining the world really that differently from the way it is. We can easily remove the air in a room. Maybe at the time the thought experiment was come up with, at the time the thought experiment was thought of, it wasn't the case that you could just remove the oxygen from the room or the air from the room. And so maybe it was quite outlandish back then. But it seems like what you're testing there is it's not a normative principle, right? It's not a should. It's more a it will. So it's like an empirical principle or a metaphysical principle. It's not an ethical principle that you're testing. And almost all the thought experiments we come up with test shoulds. Although I have a favorite, which I'll talk about a bit later, that isn't an ethical thought experiment. So I'm not sure how to think about these things, but my intuition is that science-based thought experiments like Einstein's don't count. They're more like novels. And a novel wouldn't always count as a thought experiment, I don't think. But on your definition, I think it would.
Ursula Le Guin, who happens to have one of my top 10 thought experiments, The Ones Who Walk Away from Omelas, that story is a thought experiment, quite explicitly. But she also says in the introduction to her novel, The Left Hand of Darkness, that this book just is intended to be a very large thought experiment. And that's how she thinks of fiction generally. I believe she also says that. So there's also like an implicit sort of size constraint that philosophers assume when they think of thought experiments. They're not thinking of the Olive War and Peace as a thought experiment. They're thinking of something a paragraph sized, not like a sentence, not a novel, but a good paragraph or two, or maybe a little bit longer would exhaust the thought experiment.
But I think Jason does get onto something interesting, which is that there is a certain kind of thought experiment that really is just an experiment when you are unable to have the apparatus to pull it off. And so you imagine, if we could do this thing, what would happen? And so, that science case that you give seems to fall into that category. There's a sense in which I suppose a novel differs from a thought experiment in that you're adding in all this other stuff. So the thought experiment might be the core of the novel, and you're adding in characterization and a plot and, texture and all sorts of things. And that can happen with philosophical thought experiments. And it sometimes makes me think that you can jig the experiment in these ways that aren't about reason, but are about rhetoric and persuasion. And that the particular lens you have on the experiment can achieve a different result. So one of the thought experiments that comes up to my mind is Judith Giles Thompson has this case called people seeds. And so the idea is that the way that human beings are born is that you have these people seeds that float through the air, and if they land on your carpet, they will then start to develop into a human being. She says, imagine that you want to protect yourself from this, you're not ready to have a child, and so you put up, windows to block the seeds coming out. But, occasionally it gets a bit hot, so you need to open the windows, so you have like a wire mesh that keeps the seeds out. But the mesh is only like 99.8% effective, just like a condom. And so occasionally a seed is going to get through the mesh, land on your carpet, and the question is, are you entitled to get a vacuum cleaner and hoover it up? And she thinks you are. And this is sort of one of the defenses for abortion. And I think a lot of people go, yeah, I think I'm pretty comfortable like hoovering up this thing growing up on my carpet. But why? It's because it's so outlandish, it's so strange, it's so different from how we ordinarily produce human beings that we just don't have the same kind of emotional resonance. So it seems like we tell the story in a different way, which is, imagine that you grow up in a home and, you get to watch your future brothers and sisters, slowly being born by developing on the carpet. And every day the family gets together and they sit around and they look at the development and they invite their friends around, and everybody's excited, and they talk about how they themselves had come from different kinds of rugs and Persian rugs and these rugs, and it is part of the society that you live in. You might then think this is a very sacred process, and the idea of just whipping out the vacuum cleaner and destroying this life would suddenly seem wrong. And so depending on how you do the what if and how you build it up, seems like you get a different intuition. And thought experiments have this ability to be a bit deceptive because there's a narrative device going on. And I think it's worth trying to pick them apart and having some level of skepticism about the device, as enjoyable as they are.
It seems to me like the device has to necessarily abstract out of an everyday situation to a different situation that's sufficiently different, because otherwise you'll always just get the same intuition that you would have had previously. The thought experiment won't elicit anything new. So let's say we want to talk about the egg. An egg lands on the carpet. If you talked about an egg landing on the carpet, you'll just produce the same intuition that you would have about eggs in everyday life. The value of the thought experiment is precisely in not calling it an egg. So I think you're absolutely right that thought experiments have an agenda. There's an underlying narrative that pushes you in a certain direction. But that's the case with every thought experiment. I think people just dislike certain thought experiments because they push them and they have an agenda opposite to their own. In other words, I can't imagine a thought experiment so abstract that it produces the wrong intuition that's strongly held. The fact that it produces a strongly held intuition means that the thought experiment is a strong thought experiment. I'm not sure the level of outlandishness makes it any less legitimate.
But in the case of that one, I feel like I don't have an intuition about it, but I have the reaction that in a world where there were people seats, people would be saying, my carpet, my choice. And other people would be saying, you were a people seat too once. And so I think the problem that Mark is illustrating here is that it's a failure to really think through the thought experiment, to really follow through with it and try to think about the world that you're supposed to conjure up. So I think one thing we've got to be careful about is thinking that we're imagining something when you're not. Julia Gilef has this good example of a failure of empathy where a mother says, how would you like it if somebody hit you, the way he just hit another kid? Oh, I wouldn't mind a bit. I would. Like, okay, that kid isn't really imagining being in the other person's position. And I think there are lots of ways where we can think that we're imagining something, but we're not really, because in order to imagine the people seat stuff, you'd have to imagine this comprehensive world that's completely different. And being a member of a different culture, like what would culture be like in a people seat world, and how that would shape our intuitions. And it's just really, really hard to imagine all of that stuff. So in order for there to be an intuition that isn't going to be a novel, like a complete imagining of a whole world, but something to help us think about something precise, you want to take like the minimal amount of steps away from reality, I think.
So I wonder if that's true. I mean, let's take some classically accepted thought experiments. So these are thought experiments that I think most philosophers would say, I like that thought experiment. But I mean, you can disagree. You can tell me if these thought experiments are not classically accepted. So let's take the trolley problem, for example. So imagine a world where you're driving a trolley or you, the bystander next to a train track, and there's a train chugging along, and on the one track, there's all these people tied up, and on the other track, there's fewer people tied up, and it's going to hit the track with more people, and if you pull the lever, you can hit the track with less people instead. Now, what kind of world would you have to have for that? Especially in the iterations of that trolley problem. You'd have, for example, a piece of beautiful art on the one track and people on the other track. Sure, the metaphysics of that world is the same as our world, but what kind of world would that really be like, where people are just tied to train tracks and pieces of art tied to train tracks, and suddenly you're a conductor all of a sudden, and you'd have to expand out that world quite a lot. So I think the point of the thought experiment is always a bracketing exercise. So I want you to just consider this set of features of this world. Don't worry about all the others. We don't need to write a whole novel about all the other features and all the characters in that world and how they would operate. I want you to transport your everyday intuitions from this world into that world with everything else bracketed out and just the features of the thought experiment that we want to discuss. Now, what are your intuitions here? Have they shifted? So, a question I wanted to ask both of you is, when we're talking about a thought experiment, are we talking about an analogy? Are they the same thing? So, when you talked about Plato's cave, for me, that's not a thought experiment. That's just an analogy. Is there a distinction between a thought experiment and an analogy? So in Mark's case, he talked about the wire mesh being similar to a condom, that every so often something will get through it. Like 98% of the time it'll be effective, but 2% of the time it won't, whatever the percentages are. Is every thought experiment just a sophisticated analogy?
It seems like analogies are an important part of it, that if it's disanalogous, we have reason to reject it. And there's a sense in which, if it's truly an analogous case, whatever principles we derive from the thought experiment, we can import over. I suppose what I'm getting at is that sometimes you sketch the world in such a manner that we just don't have intuitions about that. And because we don't have intuitions about it, we then come to the wrong result. And so that's why with the Thompson case, I think if you flesh that world out differently, you could change the intuition that comes out. So because people just like, that's so bizarre, the idea of the people growing up on the carpets, and I'm generally comfortable with hoovering stuff up on carpets, I guess that's why I'm okay with that. But you flesh it out and you make it this sort of, sense of there's a whole community and the history and the culture, then maybe your intuition starts to shift around. The other one that I think is a classic lecturer's trick is the experience machine. So the way that thing is generally told is, would you plug in? Now, and you ask people, those of you who would plug in, put your hands up. Okay, and so you get a smattering of hands, and they go, see, everybody besides the psychopaths in the room, have the intuition that you shouldn't plug in. If you tell it differently, which is, listen, guys, I've got a very strange thing to tell you. You're all brains in a vat, or you're all Neo in the Matrix, and let me tell you what that world looks like. It's pretty grim. You're basically being fed on gruel. But you're plugged into this wonderful thing. All the friendships that you have, all the experience that you have, all of this stuff is a simulation. How many of you guys want me to unplug you? Put your hands up. I think you'll get the same number of hands. And so what it's showing is that there's a way you can trick these experiments and how you tell them to get a certain jiggered result. First of all, if you want people to put their hands up, people generally don't. So you can kind of do a positive negative game like that. There's also the sense in which we go, how are we gathering these intuitions? Like, are these the kinds of things that you should do en masse? Is it an experimental philosophy? We go and survey 10,000 people and that gives us the answer. If we think about the kinds of things that statisticians bear in mind when they ask people questions, are philosophers doing the same things? Is it just it's one of these tales that gets told so often that there's just a standard way of doing it, but we haven't applied any of the ordinary restrictions that sociologists would have, and that's why we get these funny results. And as I say, if you rejig the question, then you get different answers.
I mean, I think it's a good point. There is a sort of status quo bias there, but I wonder if the you're in the machine now, do you want to unplug, is exactly the same experiment with just the status quo switch, because I think people are going to assume that the world they're familiar with is the paradigmatic real world. It's like Chalmers' point in the paper, the matrix is metaphysics. So this is the real world. So whatever I'd be unplugging into, that this terrible place, that couldn't really be the real world. So I wonder whether there's another variable that's sneaking in there somehow.
Well, the kind of classic argument against the experience machine is supposed to be that you wouldn't really be achieving any of the stuff in this simulacrum world. But if you say, well, you are in it now, it's just made of bits and bytes, or it's delusional in some manner, but you think it's valuable, and you at least would have a strong hesitance about unplugging, that can buff the world up a little bit. And you might say, well, now when I ask you, do you want to plug into a world that is as good as this one? Maybe it's just another experience machine, away from base reality. Then it starts to look a bit more plausible. So I do think the way that you tell it makes a difference. But your point is right, which is you kind of have to do iterations on these experiments to work out what are the variables? Why are people coming up with these particular answers? There's a site that runs people through like 10 different thought experiments and then sees how consistent you are in your answering. And I think that's quite a nice thing to do. Often, the trolley, when you first tell it to people, they go, yeah, obviously you pull the switch, it's 5 versus 1, easy. Once you start to give the other variants, like you're the one, pushing the fat guy off the bridge, or, you're the doctor who's carving up an innocent homeless person to save 5 lives, then they start to get uncomfortable. And through that process, you go, okay, well, what's the difference? Where does the difference lie? And then like you can get into things like active versus passive killing, or maybe it's just the visceralness of it. Maybe if it's distant, we have different intuitions. If you're the guys to get your hands bloody, then you feel differently. And then we know it's not actually a moral consideration that's doing the work, it's some aesthetic one.
I'm a huge fan of thought experiments, even if you could construct the thought experiment a different way so that you produce the opposite intuition. I think that's a valuable exercise. And I think all thought experiments have that agenda. So it's okay that they push you in a certain way. And I think the exercise that Spencer's engaging in of saying, okay, but I actually don't find that other version of the thought experiment as convincing. I think that's the right way to approach it, is to say just because a thought experiment could be constructed differently doesn't mean, with a different intuition, doesn't mean that it's not a valuable thought experiment or a valuable world that we're generating. I'll tell you what does worry me a lot about thought experiments, and it's a concern that I haven't allayed in my mind, is what they found is that if you tell the very same thought experiment to the same person in a different way, not constructing it in a different way, but just through a different mechanism, they'll come up with different intuitions. So, for example, the trolley problem, the original trolley problem, where this train's going to chug along and hit 5 people unless you pull a lever and it hits 1, most people say, okay, pull the lever. If you tell that very same thought experiment to someone in their left ear versus someone in their right ear, you get different answers. And it's also the case that for bilingual people, if you tell them the thought experiment in one language and another language that they also speak fluently, you often get very different intuitions. So what's going on there? That worries me a lot. There, you're not changing the thought experiment to elicit a different intuition. You've got the very same thought experiment. The recording's the same. You just click play in the left ear or in the right ear, and you get different answers. That worries me enormously, because if that is the case, then, well, which ear do we favor? It seems arbitrary. And then all our intuitions in those cases don't seem to carry any philosophical weight.
So how robust are those findings? I wonder, because that sounds like the sort of stuff that I've heard. Here's a study showing that these intuitions are out, and then later there's something wrong with it. That's my initial, not very interesting response to that. Maybe a slightly more interesting one is, this is just the problem of disagreement, right? Just as Mark and I might have different intuitions about the same thought experiment, Jason in 2 different time slices has different intuitions in response to the same thought experiment told the same way. So I guess what I want to say is, if there's this situationist critique of thought experiments and intuition mongering in philosophy, then the answer to that should be whatever the answer is to the problem of peer disagreement, because they seem to be different ways of getting at the same problem.
I suppose there's a sense in which when we disagree, we're able to explain why we disagree, and we can say, look, we just have different moral frameworks, and there might be a point at which we just can't boil it down anymore. So Joel Feinberg had this view that moral discussions can only ever happen to the person. So you can say to someone, given what your framework is, I'm going to accept that, and let me show you why some of the conclusions that you've reached are wrong based on your own framework. It's quite hard to say, the only thing that matters is utility, and the other person says the only thing that matters is dignity. You're then kind of talking past each other, and so the conversation might just have to end because there's no kind of common agreement. I suppose, I would share your concern that these sorts of findings might not be replicable, that if you tried to run that experiment again, it wouldn't work. That the replication crisis in the sciences, I'm sure, is very much there in the social sciences, and it wouldn't surprise me if it was there in experimental philosophy, and so that might explain it. But as you say, even if it were true, it might be the kind of thing that you can get around. What is useful about thought experiments is you can say to someone, given what you believe, let me give you a case and see if you want to be consistent. And you can make the person bite a series of bullets where they go, I'm very, very uncomfortable with what my own framework now leads me to believe. And I'm either going to just say, so what? I no longer believe in rational connections to things, or I don't want to, I'm just going to ignore the bullets and that kind of stuff. Or they go, I better reconsider something. So maybe there's some move I've made that's wrong, and I want to undo that. And so even if it is the case that we have fundamental disagreement about things, you can still use thought experiments to get someone to refine their own position and make that position more palatable.
Yeah, as far as what you said earlier about if it's interpersonal disagreement, the other person can say why they have the disagreement. They can appeal to a framework. But my thought was Jonathan Haidt's term, moral dumbfounding, where people just, I don't know, that just seems wrong to me. I can't give a reason. I don't know. That is pretty ubiquitous. I would be hard pressed to give a framework that would capture most of my reactions to different philosophical thought experiments. And if I did, it would probably be a post hoc rationalization, So I don't really know that is a point of difference. Maybe it's not.
Well, I often think about how these conversations go, which is that there's a digging in of trenches while the conversation's going. As you say, there might be some post hoc rationalization. But then what happens with the fullness of time is that you then reflect and you say, okay, some of those things are still niggling me. I've got this stone in my shoe, and I guess I should try and resolve it one way or the other. And later when you have the conversation with your friend, you might say, well, I've always believed that, but you've actually updated your views. I mean, Jason and I have had like 150 people on our show, and between episodes, we are constantly debating each other and using thought experiments throughout. And I think both of us have shifted our positions on many, many things. And one nice thing about having recordings is you can go back and you can check, what is your intuition there? Has it shifted? Often I think the nature of conversation is such as that we kind of forget it. And maybe that's healthy. Maybe it's not a bad thing because you're not so wedded to your position. There are very few scholars, I think, who will publicly change their mind in print. I think it's often an admirable thing to do. And I think you kind of want to encourage that idea that you can change your mind, that you don't always have to, push one position because you used to hold it at a prior time. You could say, well, I've been persuaded. Someone like Frank Jackson did that, after Mary's Room, which is one of the great thought experiments. Enough counter cases came to him that he thought, maybe I'm wrong.
So I find listening to a thought experiment which has an agenda opposite from a prior belief of mine to be a fascinating experience, because I listen to the thought experiment. It pushes me to have an intuition in a certain direction, which I resist. I don't want to have that intuition because I don't believe that view. But the initial reaction is always that I'm totally enthralled by the thought experiment. I'm in its thrall. I agree with what the author has just said. I buy it. It's the same feeling I get when I read a well-written philosophical paper arguing for a position that isn't mine. I immediately agree with the author. My initial reaction is always to agree. And then I remember, oh no, but I definitely disagree with this author. And now I need to come up with a series of objections to the thought experiment, to the argument, find ways of fighting it. But I don't buy when people say, for example, what Spencer said earlier, I just don't have that intuition, or I don't have that intuition in this case. I always have the intuition that the thought experimenter wants me to have. I always have it. But then my philosophical brain kicks in and starts producing objections which change the intuition. So is that what's going on in your head, Spencer? Do you initially get the intuition that they want you to get, the thought experiment giver wants you to get, and then you slowly change your own mind?
In the people seeds case, no. In other cases, I have the reaction that you're describing where it's like, no, but that can't be right. But like I have that reaction arguing with Stephen Kirshner a lot because he's very good at doing that. Where I initially think, yeah, it's okay. You've created some dissonance there that I'm now forced to resolve.
With Stephen, I have that experience and then one more step. So he gives the thought experiment or he gives the case, and then I'm like, yeah, I get it, but it's very uncomfortable. So second step, I need to find some reason why you're wrong. And then we argue some more. And I'm like, well, maybe Stephen, you're right. So that was my experience on the episode we last filmed with you, Spencer, with Stephen, on whether we should be grateful to soldiers, to American soldiers. And, my initial intuition when I read the claim was, no, that's nonsense. Then Stephen starts giving his thought experiments and his reasoning. And then I thought, okay, no, that makes sense, but there must be a problem with it. And ultimately he convinced me. And I find that roller coaster a wonderful experience. That's what I love most about philosophy, is this roller coaster of, oh yeah, I totally get what you're saying. I agree. And then, no, but there must be some huge problem. But no, actually, I think you've argued well for your position. And if a philosopher can take me on that roller coaster, I love it so much. What I find is that a lot of non-philosophers hate that roller coaster. The very same experience that I find delight in, they find incredibly horrifying. You know, their parents taught them this view when they were 5. They've held it all their lives. And now you're questioning it, but now you're affirming it, and now you're questioning it. And that's horrendous to think about. So this emotional roller coaster that happens with thought experiments is not for everyone.
I think that's a wonderful way of putting it. I had a late night chat with a close friend of mine about antinatalism. We stayed up until about 2. And, you know, he'd sort of not been exposed to arguments before, and I just sort of, you know, gave him David Benatar's position. He's got 2 kids. And I went to bed and I saw him the next day, and he said, you know, how'd you sleep? I said, oh, like a baby. He said, I couldn't get a wink. He said, you completely and utterly torn away the fabric of everything that I believe. He's like, how did you just go on with your life like that? And I think that's the interesting thing. Some people recoil from philosophy because it takes you on a journey that's very uncomfortable. And I think some people don't like roller coasters, they don't like horror movies. And maybe the more we've done it, the more we get inured to it and the more we like it. And I think part of it is, if you dedicate your life to finding out what's true, philosophy is one of the best ways to get there. And you often are going to go a strange route to get there. You're going to wind up believing some bizarro things that are completely at odds with everything that you've been told. And maybe you hold those bizarre positions for a while and then you sort of, you know, push them back. But you, in that truth-seeking process, you have a lot of fun. I've taken the view over the years that, you know, philosophy really isn't for everybody, that some people lack the capacity, that they don't have the stomach for it, that it's just unappealing. But there are many people who I think will find that absolutely delightful. And it's one of the things I like about doing our show is that it's, you know, hits a broad audience. And I think Spencer does that as well, that you can take people on these interesting journeys. And thought experiments are such a nice way to get there, because you've got this cool little narrative, and that seed is planted in your brain. Really, it can cause havoc, but it can, you know, be wonderful.
I think it's great, Jason, that you have that attitude that you do, that sort of openness. I'm not to the extreme that you describe of the people who don't like philosophy, of course, but I don't think I am quite in that state as you. I mean, maybe it would be better if I were, but I do tend to find that it's like, I tend to think like, okay, how am I going to defend my turf? And that's not always a good thing. I mean, it can help. I could help the other person make that person's view, you know, all the stronger, or his case stronger. But I can't say I enjoy being proved wrong and actually mean it.
You know what it's like for me? It's almost like watching a magician or an illusionist. I sit down, and obviously I know that everything, before the show even starts, I know that everything I'm about to see is not real. Right. So I know that ahead of time. But in order to enjoy the show, I have to suspend disbelief. So I sit there and I put on a smile and I'm like, okay, show me the tricks. Show me the tricks. And I see the trick and I go, wow, that's amazing. You made the Eiffel Tower disappear. Or, you know, obviously you didn't. I know that in the back of my head. You didn't make the Eiffel Tower disappear. But in order to enjoy the show, you've got to almost believe it for a split second. And then your brain, of course, will start to ask, well, how did he do that? What's the trick? And that's part of the enjoyment too, is the calculating, you know, what's the problem? But if you don't sit there and enjoy the show initially, maybe you don't fully appreciate the punch of the argument, the punch of the thought experiment. It's like, if you don't suspend your disbelief initially, maybe you're missing out on a bit of the argument itself.
Except for, it sounds like for you, sometimes the Eiffel Tower really does disappear.
Just for a split second. So I had this experience. Mark and I went to Thailand, and we went to, it was a karaoke bar. Well, it was a drag show. And there were all these drag performers, and they were singing, they were apparently singing these very famous songs. But of course, they weren't singing. They were just lip syncing incredibly well. And at one point, I turned to someone at the bar and I said, is she really singing that? Is she really singing that song? And he said, no, I promise you, she's not singing. And I said, no, but it's so real. It gave me goosebumps. It was so real. But I knew somewhere deep inside that she wasn't singing the song. But the suspension of disbelief improved my experience of the show, my enjoyment of the show so much. And I think that's the approach I like to have with our guests is guest comes on the show, gives the thought experiment, and I'm like, I'm all the way there with the guest. Yes, that's amazing. That's such a great argument for your position. And then I immediately think, okay, yeah, but I disagree with the position, so there must be a problem with the thought experiment or the argument. Let me find the hole. But that initial sort of stepping into that philosopher's shoes, I find hugely rewarding for myself. And it also allows me not to straw man the argument. So it really, because I want that argument to work in that moment. I want it to work. I'm right there with the philosopher giving the thought experiment. And then I guess reality comes and dumps 1,000 bricks on me. But yeah, that's the process.
I think having the right aesthetic disposition is useful to fully engage with something, that being able to open yourself up to it, to fully be immersed, let it land on you, be sympathetic to it, and then to step back and then, diagnose it and see what the problems are, is better than going in with this is all bullshit. Like, I don't believe a word that's coming out of your mouth, and I'm going to try and listen just so I can find ways to prove that you're an idiot and you're wrong. I love the comparison to magic. There's a show called Penn and Teller's Fool Us, where they basically said, as magicians who've been doing this for 30 years, it's very rare for anyone to be able to pull the wool over our eyes and for us to have that sense of childlike wonder. And so if you manage to fool us, you win a prize. And so they sit there and they watch, and most of the time they know exactly what you've done. They enjoy the performance of it. And then afterwards they tell you, look, we think you did it in this way. And, this is how many other people before you have done it. And occasionally they say, I don't know how you did it. And that's amazing. And maybe they work it out, at midnight a month later. And I think that's the trick of good philosophy, is that it can make you suddenly surrender a deeply held belief. And you can go, wow, that's amazing. And I'm going to change my life because of it. And maybe afterwards you backtrack on that and you think about it and you let all the blocks fall. I mean, I think about philosophy's had an impact on all three of us, although not exactly in the same way, in that all three of us changed our diets because of philosophy. So Spencer and I don't eat meat. Jason used to be a vegetarian, and because of philosophy now does eat meat. And I think one of the interesting intuitions that most people have is that average Joes go, there's nothing wrong with eating meat, but also there's certain animals that it's very bad to treat badly. So, my little dog is very cute and I love my little dog. And if anybody wanted to hurt my little dog, I would think they were evil. And so Alistair Norcross has this great case of Fred's puppies, where you're at Fred's house and you're walking around and you get to the basement and there's just a whole bunch of these little puppy dogs. And they're in a corner and they're being tortured and maligned and eventually killed. And you say to Fred, what kind of a person are you? You always struck me as a completely normal, wonderful person, and I find out that you're torturing puppies to death in your basement. He says, no, there's been a bit of a misunderstanding. I've got this strange condition where when I taste chocolate, it basically tastes like sawdust to me. But if you torture the puppies, they produce this little enzyme called kokomo. And if I eat the kokomo, then the chocolate tastes great. So it's fine, right? And you go, no, it's not fine. You're torturing the puppies to death just so chocolate tastes better. That can't be right, And so when you say to the meat eater, he says, well, bacon tastes good, so I don't mind torturing the pigs to death. You say, okay, but hold on, but you're not comfortable in the puppy's case. And that's a nice little, visceral case where someone goes, oof, I'm definitely uncomfortable in the puppy's case. I probably should be uncomfortable in the other animal's case. How do I really draw this line besides it's my dog, or puppies are cuter than Babe? Those sort of things don't really seem defensible. And it's the kind of thing where you find a lot of philosophers, are vegans or vegetarians because of these kinds of cases, because of guys like Peter Singer. And often there's some visceral reaction that people have to a particular kind of story.
You guys forgot that it's magic, right? You guys forgot when these thought experiments are raised that actually it's not true. so you forgot that you bought a ticket to the show and you're all in. So you're all these philosophers have been sitting in these philosophy classes at undergraduates and at postgraduate level, and they heard all these thought experiments, and they're like, yeah, no, I'm in. But you forgot to do the flip at the end. The ton of bricks didn't come down. So the philosopher that I love for pulling the wool off of my eyes is Susan Wolf. And I know that Spencer doesn't like her arguments at all for this. And the thought experiment that she gives is called the Moral Saints thought experiment. So the Moral Saints thought experiment says, well, imagine a world where we always did the right thing. What kind of world, what kind of life would you have to live? You'd have to be helping people constantly all the time. You'd never have time or the will to do anything that is for entertainment purposes. You'd never learn how to play tennis, for example. You'd never watch a movie, read a book. Everything you ever do would be to help others. You wouldn't accumulate any possessions of your own because you'd be giving everything away to people who need more. You would never do anything for enjoyment's sake. And she says, well, that would be a terrible kind of person to be around. Imagine your child came to you and said, I want to become a moral saint. You'd say, no, please don't do that. You'll turn into an awful, boring person. And Spencer and Mark both find this thought experiment very unconvincing, but it was the reason why I started eating meat again, because the view that she gives is, well, there are certain things we do that are immoral, and I agree that eating meat is immoral, but that doesn't mean that you should always do the moral thing. And when immoral acts are below a certain threshold, they no longer carry the kind of impetus or obligation to avoid them that we would normally think without Susan Wolf's thinking, without her meta principle. And yeah, I think you're right, Mark, that it's really interesting that that philosophy can produce very different results in people. I used to teach vegetarianism at first and second year level, and I also had some students pushing one way or the other. So I had students who walked in as meat eaters, walking out as vegetarians, and some who walked out eating meat who walked in as vegetarians. Not necessarily because they heard Susan Wolf's argument. Often when they listen to the arguments for vegetarianism, they find them unconvincing. And previously they'd been vegetarian, and they think to themselves, okay, but I had a shaky ground for my view in the first place, even if they don't listen to the arguments against vegetarianism. So yeah, I find philosophy very, very helpful, because what it does is it drills down to our core beliefs. And it forces us to really examine what our reasons are for holding those beliefs. And I think what's so valuable about a thought experiment is just for a moment, you're asked to imagine being a different person, a person with a radically different set of beliefs. And that exercise in empathy for a totally different perspective on the world allows us to deepen our position on in our own world.
I don't really know what you mean when you say you're imagining being a different person, because I always think it's whether or not I would plug into the experience machine or what have you. Could you say more about that?
Yeah, I mean, for me, what makes me who I am is my psychological profile. And a big part of my psychological profile are my fundamental core values or beliefs. And so when a thought experimenter asks me to imagine a situation where I hold a core value that's completely different from the one that I've held my whole life, I feel like that thought experiment is asking me to be a different person. They're asking me to imagine myself as a different person.
So is this lethal to you, right? If it changes your, or threatens to change your fundamental beliefs, and you are your fundamental beliefs, how are thought experiments survivable?
Yeah, so I think that if a thought experiment doesn't just temporarily through the process of suspending disbelief change your mind, but permanently if it changes your mind. You know, when I walked into that class with Thaddeus Metz, and Thaddeus Metz gives Susan Wolf's Moral Saints example, and before walking into that class, I avoid eating meat, and after walking into that class, I eat meat, I think he killed me. I think he killed me and there was a new Jason. But I think that you might say, well, then the problem is that seems to happen all the time. But I don't think it does. I think it's very rare that we change our fundamental beliefs. Thad Metz just happened to do that for me. I mean, I can count the number of times on one hand that I've changed fundamental beliefs. Mark said to me, we've shifted our positions over time, and that's true. Although I can't remember shifting mine. I think just Mark's shifted his. but the point is that often those shifts will be small on specific issues. when we're talking about like a fundamental shift in our everyday behavior because of some fundamental principle that's changed, that's significant. And I think then you've got Jason 2.0.
An ongoing conversation between Jason and I is what constitutes, your death. And, we've come up with many cases to try and test this idea, and under what conditions you would cease to exist, and whether you can, be put on ice, whether you could survive being cryogenically frozen, whether you can have gappy existence. And it's quite a nice way to test a fundamental question, which is, who you are. Is it just your body? Is it your mental states? And these sort of thought experiments are just such a wonderful way to test that out. I mean, I think one of the greatest thought experiments is, Parfit's teletransporter. That little case, that little bit of like, Star Trek sci-fi just opens up so much discussion.
Go ahead and give it.
The case is this. Someone says to you, we've got this teletransporter, you could jump on a spaceship and you can go to Mars and you could, take 5 years, or you can just walk through it and you'll pop up on the other side. You want to do it? You say, yeah, that sounds great. They go, would that be you on the other side? You say, of course it would be me. Atom for atom, duplicate of you. You do the teletransporter again, and as you land in Mars, you get a little video screen of what was in the booth, and there you see the original you. And they say, look, sorry, there was just a little bit of a problem with the machine. So what it normally does is that as you walk in, it shreds you and then reprints you on the other side. The shredder wasn't working, but don't worry about it. We're just going to put a bullet in this guy's head. You'll be fine. You're on Mars. And now you start to go, ooh, who's on Mars? Is it me? Did I just die through this process? What is it that would make me me? Is it my physical body? Can I be in two places at the same time? Those are some interesting questions. And whichever path you take kind of opens up all sorts of uncomfortable avenues.
I wanted to go back to the experience machine. I have these variations that it sounds like you're not on board with, but I think we should kick that around a bit. So the original experience machine is Nozick's. It's distinct from the Descartes evil demon thought experiment, which we should also say something about. But Robert Nozick's thought experiment was to imagine that you can plug in to a machine where you could have this really amazing, pleasurable life, but you'd be plugged in forever, and everyone you would interact with would be virtual. And a lot of people have the intuition that wouldn't be the best possible life you could live as an experience machine life. And that's supposed to put pressure on hedonism, the view that pleasure is the only intrinsic good. Okay. So I think that there are actually many different variations of this that you could give. One variation is just to imagine your friends are in the experience machine with you. So you're interacting with their virtual avatars, and it no longer works as a thought experiment that is motivated against hedonism, because now you've got other goods, because now you can have friendship and all these things. So that modification changes what the thought experiment could be targeted to criticize, like as a philosophical view. Another way of modifying it is that you could imagine that it's just you alone in the experience machine and a bunch of, computer players, but then you unplug once a week. You spend one day a week in the normal world, and you can talk to normal people and say, how is your experience machine life? And we can ask ourselves, like, surely there doesn't seem to be anything bad with like an hour long, virtual reality experience that's really, really compelling. But if you're just spending like 5 minutes a week outside of the experience machine, it's almost like the original one. So this is another way you can ask, like, how much of those other goods do we need? So then it's a thought experiment, not about hedonism versus these other goods, but like, how do those other goods potentially weigh against pleasure? Because you're getting a ton of pleasure in the experience machine. You can only get those other goods outside of the experience machine, but how should you budget your time? So what do you think of that variation?
So I really like it. And I think it's going to produce a similar set of considerations to the ones that I want to produce in the Susan Wolf example. So in the Susan Wolf case, the question is, should you always do the moral thing? No, you shouldn't, because there's all these other values at play. So there's learning how to play tennis, and there's learning how to read a book and enjoy a novel and have fun with friends and eat a lovely meal. And so there's all these other perfections, she calls them. So there's all these other perfections that you would undermine if you only held up one perfection, morality. Now, in the thought experiment, in the Nozick thought experiment case, so in the experience machine case, all these iterations suggest, well, the question is, yeah, we all agree that pleasure is nice, right? But is it the only thing that's good for us? Is it the only value that's good for us? Or are there other values that are good too for us? Are there other values that we should hold valuable? And I think that, Susan Wolf's solution to the problem is to say, well, it's not that morality is totally unimportant. It's just not the pinnacle value. It's one amongst many. And maybe in the thought experiment case, the answer is the same. So it's that, well, the values that we should hold dear in our lives don't all reduce to one, to hedonism. There's a multiplicity of values. And in the experience machine, we'll only have pleasure and not these other values in the original iteration of the thought experiment. In the other iterations, you've got these other values creeping in, and so it becomes more attractive to step into the machine.
Yeah, I think having those different variants gets you to locate what the force of the experiment is. And I think some of us say that pleasure can't be the only value, because if you choose to pick between the one where you're engaging only with NPCs or with real people, if you think the real people one, would be more valuable, then you think there are things that matter beyond hedonistic pleasure. And so that gives you some indication. But given that you've brought up Nozick, I thought we should bring up John Rawls. And the second episode of our show, we give one of our favorite thought experiments. So the case is this. You wake up in a hospital bed, you are covered head to toe in bandages, and you have a severe case of amnesia. You don't know your name, you don't know your race, but you have a basic understanding of economics, sociology, and history. And a doctor walks into the room and he says, I'm going to give you a once-in-a-lifetime opportunity, which is I'm going to let you design the rules for the world that you walk into. And once you walk into that world, we'll take off your bandages and you will find out whether you're black or white, whether you're a man or a woman, whether you're old or young. And so you sit and you think about it and you say, well, I could have a rule which is that, men get to beat their wives every day. But what if I wind up being a wife? Well, that would be a bad idea for me out of rational self-interest. What if I had a racist rule? Well, I could be in the disfavored race. So it pushes you into a situation where you sort of want, equal protection for everybody, a sense of coextensive rights, and it gives us very good justification for liberal constitutions. And I think there's an enormous amount of force in those kinds of cases. One of the things that's difficult to take into account is people's appetite for risk. So one of the things that you might be, for example, is disabled. We take off the bandages and, maybe it turns out that your legs don't work. Would you want a social safety net, which is accompanied also by some kind of high form of taxation? Well, there, maybe your appetite for risk would give you different results. And if you got to roll the dice on multiple occasions and sort of take an average, you might have a different view to rolling the dice once. And so, I think Rawls' experiment gets us some way, but it can also distort our intuitions because of the way that it's structured.
So yeah, Rawls' thought experiment is interesting. I find the thought experiment compelling at first listen, like most thought experiments, but I don't want to buy the conclusions because Rawls's proposed solution is some sort of balance between freedom and the state limiting certain people's resources, or at least their opportunities, and handing over those resources or opportunities to others. And so I don't want to accept the conclusions, but I see the force of the thought experiment. There's a lot of abstraction going on in that thought experiment. So the thought experiment involves abstracting from a whole society down to one person. So we're asking, well, how should society be structured? And we're abstracting all the way to a single person who is very different from me. So that person has amnesia about all sorts of things that I have knowledge of over. And the idea is that that person, given that amnesiac state, given that veil of ignorance, can start to form desires for principles that we should ultimately, as a society as a whole, have. So there's a lot of abstraction. There's an abstraction from the general to the specific, and then there's an abstraction from my specific situation to a much more generic specific situation. And that's really complicated. That takes quite a few leaps. And I mean, I don't have a problem with leaps in thought experiments, but the two of you do. So I would have thought that both of you would have quite a problem with performing so many leaps.
My reaction, I guess, is to think that this is a compelling thought experiment. When you hear it explained to me, it's like, yeah, that seems like you would want to. This is something that's supposed to motivate you to want to choose an egalitarian sort of society. But Nozick's response was something like this: that it's wait a minute, why that thought experiment? Why of all the hypotheticals is it this one? And it's that Rawls already had in mind the kind of social arrangements that he wanted, and this is a hypothetical that would get you to say that those are the just arrangements or something like that. So I don't know if that's necessarily anything wrong with the thought experiment.
Isn't that just a property of all thought experiments, though? You know, if we've got a debate between two principles, there's probably an infinite series of thought experiments we could come up with on the one side of the debate and an infinite series of thought experiments on the other side of the debate, assuming that neither principle is absurd on its face, and that they're both plausible principles that conflict. Isn't it the case that we're always being arbitrary in selecting a particular thought experiment? So surely that's not a good criticism of the thought experiment.
How do you use any thought experiment to make up your mind? Or like, how could it not just change your mind, but even incline you to one view or another if you have this sextus empiricus sort of thought that, well, they're surely just as good ones on the other side. I just haven't thought of them yet.
Yeah, it's a good question. It could be why, as I say, like to Mark sometimes, all the guests we've had on our show, over 150 guests, almost none of them have changed my mind. It's very, very rare that they change my mind. And they only change my mind about quite applied, specific, detailed claims, like Stephen Kirshner's claim about having gratitude towards American soldiers. I mean, that's so specific. It's so applied. You know, it's not a generalized claim about gratitude or a generalized claim about war. It's a highly specific case. And yes, you can sway my intuitions on that.
And you're not an American.
And I'm not American, and I'm not a soldier. So I don't have all the emotions associated with it. So it's quite easy to sway me on it. But yeah, I think you're right. And I think that's always going to be the rebuff against a thought experiment. But I think the value of a thought experiment and the reason why we use them and how we use them is to start a conversation. So the thought experiment doesn't end the conversation, it starts it. It's a way of setting up an argument with some force so that the onus of answering is on the opponent. That's what it is. It's a way to kick the ball, to get the ball started.
So what is it then about the ones that sink in, about the Susan Wolf article, where it ceases to be just a hypothetical for you? And it's like, I'm going to change the way I live, even though you're probably thinking somewhere there is someone who's arguing against Susan Wolf, not me or Mark, because we've tried, who might actually be able to change your mind. And yet she does have this ability to change the way you behave. How does that happen? If in the back of your mind, you're thinking that, you know, reason is a rogue or something like that.
It's such a good question. I don't know, because I can't say something like, well, the thought experiment agreed with something I already believed, because that wasn't the case. It changed my mind. So why did that thought experiment change my mind and not some other thought experiment on the other side of the debate? For example, Norcross's puppies. Why is that the case? I don't know. I mean, is it entirely random? Because that would be very worrying, you know, if my entire value structure is entirely randomly produced. And if mine is, everyone's is. So is that what's happening? Or is there something else? Is it that the thought experiment is genuinely a good one and others aren't? And then how do we measure that? I want to say that. So I want to say that the thought experiment is sound, that it is convincing, and others are not. But I don't have a good reason to say that. You know, you're going to come up with a bunch of objections and counterexamples to Susan Wolf's argument. And I don't see why, in principle, they're much worse objections and counterexamples than the ones I'll offer to Norcross's puppies. So it's really hard to answer that question. But I think it's a question all philosophers have to answer. You know, we all hold certain views. All philosophers do. We don't just play devil's advocate. We're not all on a brain in a vat all the time playing devil's advocate. We do hold positions. We're theists or we're atheists or we're agnostics, but regardless, you're holding a position. And why is that? Why do we hold the positions we hold? It's not because we were raised in a certain way. I mean, most philosophers don't necessarily believe what they were raised to believe. What is it? Why is it that we hold the beliefs we do? I don't know.
So I suppose we're kind of in the realm of psychology then, as opposed to reason, because you're saying, well, it just could be the case that I would have heard better things at a different point in my life and I believe that stuff. But it might be that part of the power of Wolf's case is that it lets people off the hook. It basically says, look, morality is not this trumping value. So you don't have to, do all this stuff, which would be incredibly hard. You actually get an enormous amount of control of your life. You can, fill it with meaning, with beauty. You can do some good things, and that sense of moderation might be deeply intuitive. And so if you say, well, this gets me off the hook for, a whole bunch of stuff that I'd like to do, and I can always explain it in terms of a framework that gives me quite a lot of room, that would explain why it's appealing, especially when it's in the realm of practice. You can say, well, I now don't have to, spend my life, I don't know, treating lepers and being a Mother Teresa. I can, eat wonderful food. I can, eat tasty pork. I can go to orgies, as long as I give a bit of charity and, go and check out some art galleries every so often, then I'm okay. But it's generically prescriptive as well, because it's not like there's a particular vision of a perfect life. You get a lot up to you. That seems kind of intuitively appealing and might give you a buff against anything else. I suppose the other kind is that you do have people who fundamentally change in a way that looks zealot-like. And maybe because they derive an immense amount of pleasure from being a zealot, like people who have religious conversions, become very fervent about it, sometimes for the rest of their lives, sometimes for a period. And it's, I suppose, interesting to work out, is philosophy different from this? Is it, if you become an ethical vegetarian, is that the same as, converting to Islam?
I think the problem with those sorts of explanations is it suggests that we're all totally irrational or non-rational, and we're just waiting for an argument to appear that will give us a reason to believe the position we wanted to believe in the first place. And if that was true, then it's all a game, right? It's all a game. When someone says, I believe X, basically all they're saying is, I want to believe X. They're not saying that they actually believe it for good reasons or that they know it.
We all do this to a certain extent, right? I mentioned this in my book, which I co-authored with Matt Lutz, Is Morality Real? A Debate, which you can buy, which will be available September 7th through Routledge. This has been a shameless plug. But I mentioned this, that we all do this to some extent, because think of skeptical arguments. Like the top 2 or 3 arguments for complete global skepticism, by which I mean we don't have even any justified beliefs about anything at all, or anything at all having to do with things outside our minds, or some vast swath of reality we have no justified beliefs about at all. Like the skeptic's net argument and the Cartesian demon argument. And there are a few others that are very, very hard to get around. And you hear them and it's like, okay, where have they gone wrong? Where have they gone wrong? And nobody just follows the arguments where they lead in a case like that. And I'm inclined to say, and we shouldn't, because we really do know that there's something wrong with them. That's my reaction. Nathan Ballantyne has got a really, really good illustration in his book, Knowing Our Limits, which I quote. And I wish he would have said who did this. It was an epistemology conference. And some epistemologist, or the person presenting, he writes a couple of like very innocent looking claims on the board. And he's like, okay, I'm not going to move on until everyone here agrees I've got this principle construed. So everyone agrees to it. He writes it out and it looks completely innocent. People are like, yeah, okay, get on with it. And he writes another one, same reaction. Okay, all right. And then he does a bit of logic and shows the conclusion. It's this explosive claim. And then everybody in the room was outraged. They're like, you should have told us where you were going with this first. And I kind of sympathize with the audience on that. Like, you fooled us. If we would have known we were going there with it, we wouldn't have agreed to one or both of those principles. But, the person presenting is like, no, 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 you agree with the principles, and then you see where they fall, where they go. But I think, yeah, do we ever really truly do that without also assessing what we think of the conclusions? It's always these two premises and the negation of the conclusion. Pick one, pick one. And I think that's what we're ultimately doing.
Yeah, and I think that's the value in really outlandish thought experiments, is it's meant to get you to forget what you're supposed to say in the situation. And what it's trying to do is to get you to just imagine yourself in a situation so different that it'll produce your pre-philosophical intuition. That's why philosophers love to ask non-philosophers questions about thought experiments. Something Mark loves to do is ask total strangers about their intuitions in certain cases who are not philosophers. They're not philosophers. He likes to ask their intuitions because it's sort of like this idea among philosophers that non-philosophers are almost like children. They're innocent. They haven't been polluted by philosophical arguments yet. And so they'll produce a real intuition, the one that we should really trust. Whereas you ask the philosopher, and it's the seasoned, weather-beaten, wizened philosopher who's heard 1,000 thought experiments before, and he's got this ear waiting to hear where the trick is, and you can't fool him as easily. And so, the question is, should we be behaving like these pre-philosophical people when we listen to thought experiments? Or should we be very critical at every point and saying, yeah, I see where you're going with that. I'm resisting you even before you get there.
So let me ask you this. I wasn't planning on asking this, but now I'm just curious. Did either of you have a thought experiment that you thought of when you were a kid and you didn't realize it was a thought experiment? Something you were like, what if that were true?
Yeah, I'll give you one, which was, Jason and I grew up in South Africa and grew up in that transition period from apartheid to democracy. And one of the thoughts that I had, having been raised by a black housekeeper, was what happens if you have equality? What happens if, everybody is allowed to prosper and kind of look at their own means? Is that going to mean that I'm no longer going to have a mate? And I remember puzzling through that, thinking like this would be a very good thing for the majority of South Africans and quite a bad thing for me, and thinking about that kind of moral tension. And I must have been about 6 or 7 at the time, having had this close relationship with my mate. As I say, it was kind of like a surrogate parent. And that, moral qualm you have with what's in your interest and in the interest of everyone else.
Maybe I wasn't a very imaginative child, Spencer. I'll tell you what has happened to me many times throughout my life, both as a child and as an adult, is I've heard stories told in movies, in films, in books, series, TV series, which make me realize that there is a thought experiment buried in there, or at least could be made into a thought experiment. So I think the thought experiment which captured me, or the movie that captured me the most, was a predecessor to The Matrix. It came out the year before The Matrix in 1999. And it was called The Dark City. And in the Dark City case, in this movie, what happens is there's these super powerful aliens that rule over a city of people. And when the movie starts, you don't see the super powerful aliens, you just see the people. And what happens is these people go to sleep at night, and the city is perpetually in darkness. They go to sleep at night, and when they wake up the next day, also in darkness, they wake up in a different social configuration. So the aliens have moved things around. They've moved people from one bed to another, from one building to another. They've shifted the building's landscape. They've shifted the city around, and they've implanted into all of these people false beliefs and false memories about the fact that the city and their social configurations were always this way. So Joe goes to sleep next to his wife, Susan, and wakes up the next day next to his wife, Joanne. And he has a different set of children. And he has a belief that they are his children and his wife, and they were always married, and they got married 10 years ago, and they went to Italy for honeymoon. But all of those memories and beliefs are false. And every night they get shuffled again. So I watched this movie and I thought, this is amazing. I love this. This is fantastic. And then I thought, actually, it illustrates a fascinating philosophical problem. And it's not necessarily a philosophical problem that the originators of the storyline had in mind. So the problem is with Searle's social constructionist account of social phenomena. So Searle says what makes social phenomena what they are is our collective belief in them. It's our beliefs. If we all commonly agree that Joe and Susan are married, well, then they are. They are married. And if everyone collectively believes that they have a family, then they have that family. The problem is that these sort of situations are situations in which you have the collective agreement, but the collective agreement is wrong. In other words, you're not married to this person, a new person every day with a new set of children as your family. You never had that marriage. You never had those children. It's not your family, even though you've got the collective agreement. So it presents a very nice counterexample to a principle, which is not necessarily a counterexample that the people who came up with the case originally had in mind. And I think this is an experience I have over and over again watching films, even as a child. Tons of Star Trek is like this. Although in those cases, maybe the originators of the writers of the stories had those counterexamples in mind. Science fiction is full of these kind of cases, which are amazing philosophers.
I remember wondering how I knew my parents hadn't been like kidnapped by aliens and replaced by lookalikes who had evil intentions and stuff like that. Like, how do I know? It was really like the thought of other minds. Like, how do I know what's in someone else's mind? I remember having that thought when I was like 8 or so. And I remember puzzling about how could there have been an absolute beginning of like everything? That seems weird because it seems like I could ask what happened right before then. I remember having the thought, everything we do seems like it's for something else. So is what would be the limit? Like is there an infinite regress of the future? It ends, very beginning of Nicomachean ethics. I remember having those thoughts, and I didn't know that there was a discipline devoted to exploring such questions for another decade or something.
Isn't it so cool that all these questions that puzzled our heads as children are questions that philosophers study? Isn't that so cool? I mean, isn't it so cool that we, as philosophers, study the things that matter most to people kind of at a fundamental level? And I think it's that reason that makes philosophy so interesting, and that reason that also makes philosophy so unattractive to so many people. They look at philosophy and they say, yeah, you're just talking endlessly about questions that have been asked for millennia and never will be answered, is the criticism, because we all think about these questions, certainly at the beginning of our lives, often at the end of our lives, and on the way.
So one thought is whether we will now reach the end of history when it comes to philosophy. So if you think about how things like ChatGPT have progressed over the last couple of years, at the moment, it's not the best philosopher, but maybe it reaches a point where you can get some finality. The classic Douglas Adams joke about what's the answer to the meaning of life is 42, is that really the Earth is this gigantic supercomputer that tries to answer these fundamental questions. And maybe we've now just built this supercomputer that ChatGPT will be able to really steer us in a particular direction and solve some of these quintessential mysteries. I suppose one of the questions is whether it's important who does the solving, whether we do it or whether it's done by this AI mind.
That's actually the perfect segue for the thing that I was thinking. Not that it lacks its inherent value, not that it was merely that, but I was wondering, this is a sort of cynical or pessimistic thought about philosophy. Maybe we just like going on the roller coaster that Jason is describing and thinking of all these things, but there isn't any real progress. And deep down, we don't want there to be. Deep down, if we thought that we found the truth and we've settled it, that would be disappointing, because we would want something to come along and unsettle us and keep us back on that roller coaster. And if we really had the option, if God said, okay, here it is, here are the grand cards of the universe, you can flip them over. Do I have free will? What's the true moral theory? The answers to all the big questions. You can flip them over and this is going to be it, the definitive answers. Would you hesitate Or would you be like, oh, I can't wait? I mean, I would definitely be anxious about flipping them over.
Yeah, I think that's a nice way to end.
Thank you, Spencer and Mark, for being on this joint show of Brain and Vat and Microdigressions. I think it was a fantastic show because I'm tooting both our horns here, but I really enjoyed it because it was different from our usual format where we berate one guest, but also we all got to contribute our views. And on Brain and Vat, Mark and I generally don't get to push our positions too hard. We're more interested in the guest positions. So Spencer, thank you for that opportunity for us to do that. And it's always wonderful to collaborate with you. So yes, thank you both.
Thanks so much, guys.